Thank you all for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our symposium titled Remote Delivery of Behavioral Intervention, Challenges, Successes, and Considerations Moving Forward. This symposium was initially assembled in fall of 2019 for presentation at the spring 2020 Gatlinburg conference. At the time, I was eager to find other early career researchers and students who were working on innovative technology-based interventions for children with autism, genetic disorders, and intellectual and developmental delay. Of course, in a strange twist of fate, the 2020 conference was canceled and most of daily life moved online. As somebody who was fully bought into telehealth prior to COVID, this is certainly not the implementation I would have recommended, and it made clear that remote delivery of therapy has limitations and challenges, particularly when the appropriate infrastructure does not exist. But the last year has unexpectedly launched the world a decade forward in terms of capacity for remote delivery of intervention, education, and healthcare. Like any new intervention modality, telehealth requires thoughtful planning and consideration in order to reduce, not add, burden to families. With that, I'm happy to introduce the individuals you'll be hearing from next, all of whom were ahead of the curve for thoughtful and carefully implemented technology in autism and ID treatment. To briefly introduce myself, my name is Carly Hyde, and I am currently a Master of Science student at the UCLA School of Public Health, and I'm also continuing to coordinate the clinical trial that I'll discuss today. I'm interested in improving the ability of under-resourced families with complex medical and behavioral needs to access high-quality therapies and clinical care. This last year has really helped me to narrow in on how, when, and why telehealth should be used. We'll also hear from Dr. Wainer, a clinical licensed psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, and the research director of the Autism Assessment, Research, Treatment, and Services Center at Rush University. Dr. Wainer's research focuses on identifying ways to support transportation of effective intervention to the real world to increase access to high-quality intervention for all children with and at risk for ASD. We'll then hear from Ellen Doernberg, a clinical psychology doctoral student in her 4th year at Case Western Reserve University. Ellen is broadly interested in processes of emotional, social, and behavioral development in early childhood. Specifically, she is interested in measuring and intervening in said areas for children with neurodevelopmental disorders through play-based assessment and intervention strategies, as well as utilizing parent coaching and education techniques to disseminate treatment options into the community. Third, we'll hear from Casey Okoniewski, a neurodevelopmental psychologist and current public health research analyst at RTI International, focused on assessment and intervention protocols for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as family support and advocacy across hospital, home, and school settings, particularly for rare neurogenetic disorders. Finally, it is my privilege to announce Dr. Connie Kasari, though she truly needs no introduction. Dr. Kasari, our discussant today, is a leading expert in autism research and developer of the behavioral intervention Jasper, and her commitment to enhancing the delivery of Jasper in communities is evidenced by her long list of published work and numerous accolades over 25 years. She is also the primary investigator on the remote clinical trial that I'll be discussing today, and was recently awarded a clinical translational research grant from the Department of Defense to launch a fully remote version of the study. I'm thrilled to have all of these women here today, and I now pass it to our first presenter.
Hi, my name is Wainer, and on behalf of my team, I'm presenting on our work looking at parent engagement in a self-directed versus therapist-assisted telehealth program for families of young children with autism spectrum disorder. There is strong empirical and theoretical support for parent-mediated interventions for ASD. That said, there are a number of barriers to traditional service delivery models, such as a lack of trained professionals, lengthy wait lists, and issues with transportation, which really compel examination of alternative and complementary approaches to delivering care. The last 2 decades have seen increasing interest in telehealth broadly to surmount traditional barriers to care in behavioral health and in early intervention. And these efforts have certainly been fast-tracked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Within the broad field of telehealth, there are different formats and delivery models, including self-directed digital health platforms, so things like apps and websites, as well as models that rely on or include remote support or coaching from a provider. And there's really unique benefits and costs to each of these approaches that can and should be considered when designing and developing telehealth interventions. So in our work, we've been really interested in determining how to best build telehealth programs to support parents, and especially parents of young children with or at risk for ASD, in learning evidence-based intervention strategies that can be used at home and out in the community. We've worked with reciprocal imitation training, or RIT, which is a brief, focused, naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention targeting motor imitation and joint attention within a play-based context. And for a variety of reasons, including its relative simplicity, we felt that it was well suited for adaptation to a telehealth program. So as a result, we created what was originally called Online Reciprocal Imitation Training, or online RIT, now referred to as MirMe, as a digital health tool in the form of an interactive website. The site itself contains 4 modules, each with a lesson video, self-check questions, interactive exercises, recap questions, and reflection questions, a video library, a frequently asked questions page, resources page, and a personalized dashboard. And so if you were to go through the entire site, including the supplementary pieces like the FAQ and the resources section, we estimate that it would be about 150 minutes or so of content, with about 112 unique pieces or elements of content involved in the site. The data we're presenting today comes from a pilot randomized control trial comparing a fully self-directed version of MirMe to MirMe plus remote coaching for parents of young children with ASD. To give a quick sense of the study procedures, families participate in baseline assessments, then they get access to MirMe for 5 weeks. Then at 5 weeks, we randomize participants to either receive remote coaching once per week over another 5 weeks, or to continue in a self-directed format. For the purposes of this talk, we are really just looking at questions of engagement with the MirMe website. So we're going to be presenting data on the 28 families who were given logins to the MirMe website. And after the participants were randomized at 5 weeks, we had 13 in the coaching group and 15 in the self-directed group. So the first question we had really was, will participants engage with MirMe? And this was a relevant question because much of the prior research on telehealth programs for parents of children with ASD included quite a bit of support from either a coach from the beginning of the program or from study staff along the way, with things like reminder phone calls and emails encouraging people to access the site. So we really wanted to see what would happen if we just gave parents access to the site with minimal supports. Each family was given a unique username and password, PDF instructions for how to access and use the site, and told that they could reach out to the study team with questions, but there was really no other support or contact until randomization at week 5. So when we look at just the numbers, we see that actually all 28 families at least started the website during the first 5 weeks. And after randomization, we see that 9 families in the coaching group and 6 families in the self-directed group returned to the site at some point during week 6 through 10. Our next question was, how will participants engage with MirMe? So to do that, we first looked at the average number of days accessing the program. Since participants weren't randomized until after week 5, we can actually first look at how the total sample engaged initially. So about like 4.5 days on average. And then we can actually break that down and see what it looks like broken up among those who went on to the coaching group versus those in the self-directed group. We can also look at the average number of days accessing MirMe during week 6 through 10 for both groups. And what we can see is that after randomization, there was not really a big difference on average in terms of behavior between those who got coaching and those who did not, with everyone accessing the site on fewer days relative to weeks 1 through 5. To offer just a quick snapshot of the range in user behavior, we'll provide that information in a table for each engagement outcome as well. So we see a very similar pattern when we look at the average number of logins to the site. In the total sample, we see an average of about 5.25 logins during the first period, with similar rates observed in both groups. And then again, we see that participants are logging back into the site after randomization at relatively similar rates across groups, although fewer times than during that first period. Continuing with our question of how will participants engage with NearMe, we next looked at the average number of minutes spent on the site. So if you remember altogether, if you do everything, there's about 150 minutes of content. In the total sample, we see an average of about 107 minutes, so like a little bit more than an hour and 45 minutes. And then again, we observe similar patterns between groups for weeks 1 through 5 and weeks 6 through 10, with everyone spending far less time on the site during the second 5 weeks. Finally, we looked at the average number of clicks as a proxy for pieces of program content that were being accessed or engaged. And if you recall, there are about 112 unique elements or pieces of the site that can be clicked. So no surprises here. We see a really similar pattern as with the other engagement outcomes. In total, we see an average of 151 clicks. And again, we observe similar patterns between groups during week 1 through 5, as well as week 6 through 10, with everybody accessing less content in the second 5 weeks. So what does that mean? Really, our main takeaway from these data are that we observe pretty similar patterns of program engagement behavior in the self-directed and coaching groups over the 10 weeks of the active intervention period. Next questions related to engagement that our team is currently seeking to answer include which elements of the program were participants accessing and when, as well as the timeline of program engagement. So for example, were some people engaging with the site immediately after getting a username, or did others wait until right before their study visits? We are also going to be able to explore the relationship between program engagement and variables of interest. So for example, looking at how participant characteristics might influence program engagement, as well as the relationship between program engagement and treatment outcomes, especially those like parent fidelity and self-efficacy. And then finally, as is really fundamental to digital intervention design and development, we'll use these data within a user-centered framework to refine the website to enhance target engagement with critical educational or learning elements, as well as to consider adaptive intervention models that may allow for families who need more support to be routed to coaching from the beginning. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. I just want to say thank you to our funders and the families who participated in the study, and thank you all for your attention.
I'll be talking to you now about engagement with monitoring systems in our remote clinical trial. This research story begins with a rare autosomal dominant disorder called tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC. It is a multi-system genetic disorder caused by mutations to the TSC1 or TSC2 genes, which are important for cell growth and division. Mutations in these genes lead to tumors throughout various organ systems, including the lungs, heart, eyes, and brain. TSC is also highly associated with neurodevelopmental disorders, including developmental delay, epilepsy, and autism, which we see in about 50 to 60% of kids with TSC. TSC is also often diagnosed early in life, even before birth, making it a research model for early development of autism. Early indicators of ASD led to the development of Dr. Shefali Jesse's behavioral intervention clinical trial for TSC, which uses a randomized delayed start design to administer 12 weeks of Jasper behavioral intervention to young toddlers. This study was originally designed as an in-person intervention study. However, the rarity of the disorder means that potential participants are widely dispersed throughout the US, and in the first year of recruitment, we were only able to enroll 3 participants. After conducting some qualitative interviews with many potential participant families to better understand the barriers that they were facing to enrollment, we modified the study to include a hybrid version of remote and in-person Jasper intervention. Remote parent-mediated intervention moves a lot of the study protocol into the homes of our families, which makes it critical to effectively monitor dosage, compliance, and engagement with a protocol that we can't see monitor firsthand. Therefore, the first aim of my research is to evaluate the compliance and acceptability of our caregiver reporting tools. I'll then look at the sensitivity of some of these measures to demographic factors. I used the 31 participants who have completed Jasper so far in the study, including participants from both the waitlist and immediate treatment groups. However, this clinical trial is still underway, so we won't be looking at any outcomes just yet. At the time we implemented this remote intervention, families were eager to participate in telehealth and traveled from 20 states around the country to participate at one of the 2 testing sites in Boston or Los Angeles. 13 of the 31 participants flew to reach the testing site, and 18 drove. The majority of our participant families have an income of over $90,000 per year. As the study progressed, income and distance from the testing site have lost any significant correlation with each other, as we provide ample reimbursement for travel and lodging in partnership with a patient advocacy group, NORD. Frequent hospitalizations, breakthrough seizures, and medication changes put significant medical burden on families of children with TSC. At the time of the intervention, about 43% of participants had uncontrolled seizures. Most of the participants fall in the low to very low range on the developmental assessments, and about 3/4 of participants showed some autism red flags before starting intervention. Participants also received anywhere from 0 to 7 hours of intervention outside of the clinical trial per week. Participants in the study complete a mix of remote and in-person intervention sessions. After an initial ground laying session, in person, parents are asked to go home and practice Jasper every day for up to 30 minutes. They record a session once per week using the iPad we provide and upload it to a private box server to be reviewed by the interventionist. At weekly Zoom sessions, the interventionist teaches the parent new Jasper skills and coaches them using their uploaded videos. Both the caregiver and the interventionist complete online questionnaires sent directly to their email from our database. Caregivers also received an automated text every evening at about 7:30 p.m. asking how many minutes of Jasper they were able to complete each day. Importantly and unexpectedly, caregivers also use this direct text line for both tech support and emergency updates. Parents would let us know right away if their child had a hospitalization, or if they were out of town for a few days and unable to practice Jasper. From all of these remote monitoring tools, we get a few variables, including daily and cumulative number of minutes practiced and weekly seizure updates. Caregivers also provided weekly ratings of their own adherence to intervention and their perception of change in their child, and the interventionist submitted weekly ratings of the caregiver's quality of intervention, or CQI. Now I'm going to build you a picture of how all of these variables tied together by showing you data from one little girl and her mother. First, I'll add all of the remote and in-person sessions over the course of the 12 weeks, as well as the weekly videos uploaded from mom. I'm going to add a few more lines to this figure, and I want to make it clear that the scales across these different variables are not the same. So for the purpose of this visualization, we can effectively ignore the y-axis. I'm now adding daily texts sent from mom, which let us know about how many minutes they practice Jasper every day. A missing text here is counted as a no practice day, which I let parents know at the start of the intervention. I also added a cumulative number of minutes practiced, which shows that the mother here was pretty consistent throughout the intervention without any major gaps. From the weekly self-reports of adherence, which is the pink line here on top, we see that mom felt that the strategies were fairly natural to her and easy to carry out. Over the course of the intervention, mom's rating of her perception, which is the green line, of her child increased, indicating that over the 12 weeks, she saw her interacting differently with others. We can also see that this kiddo had some seizure activity, the red line on bottom, but it was managed pretty well during the intervention with medication. Finally, I'll add the interventionist rating of the caregiver quality of intervention, the CQI. Again, this mom improved over time, and overall, this is the picture of a mother and daughter who were compliant with the intervention procedures and engaged with the materials. Now compare that to a second mother and her son who is matched to case 1 on age and autism symptom severity. Case 2 received the same number of Jasper sessions and actually received a higher average CQI across the 12 weeks with a higher self-reported perception of change for her child. We also see a gap of about a month where mom was not reporting any practice, and she practiced fewer minutes per day than the mom in case 1. Now, it's possible that mom in case 2 was practicing and not reporting, but we also know that this child's seizures spiked around week 5, and mom also noted via text that they spent a few days in the hospital and they were busy moving to a new house. Obviously, life happens, and we do not expect perfect compliance with this intervention. But we also have a pretty good idea from this of what was going on for these participants during this time, despite rarely seeing them in person. This tracking system works best when families use it, and luckily, most families were regular responders. Of all of the texts sent during this time, 84% received a response. Individually, response rates ranged from 25 to 100%, but averaged at 75%. Parents practiced just about every 2 of 3 days for about 17.2 minutes per day or 94.6 minutes per week. Compliance with the questionnaires was a bit lower at 43%, despite reminders every other day if they weren't completed. Overall, we see variable levels of compliance with these reporting tools, but the results indicate that overall, excellent compliance is feasible and that on average, compliance is pretty good, especially with the text reminders. Finally, I wanted to check whether any of these variables that we're collecting through the system are sensitive to participant demographics. I mentioned earlier that income and distance from the testing site are not directly related to each other, but we do see a correlation with both distance and income and the number of minutes practiced. Practice minutes is also correlated with seizure status, and CQI is correlated with the number of outside intervention hours per week, whereas the parent reports and the interventionist's ratings were not. Now, I think that the daily text data provides valuable and consistent information, but as we continue to implement it in our study, it'll be important to consider how they relate back to demographics and eventually outcomes. Now, inclusion, accessible and inclusive research is important to families who want to benefit from high quality intervention and clinical monitoring. And it's also important for researchers who want geographically and socioeconomically diverse families who are representative of broader communities, because that's how we'll get the best and most effective interventions. Remote delivery is a critical component to more equitable and diverse research, though it's important to consider exactly how it's implemented. For example, we should provide tablets and internet hotspots as needed. We also know that outside of autism research, mobile health is a growing area of research and engagement in public health, and that's a widely and successfully implemented for low-resourced communities, who typically have very high rates of cell phone coverage and use. As autism intervention moves online, we will rely more heavily on parent reports for outcome measures. So it's critical to recognize the potential subjectivity of a parent's perspective of change and factors that can impact a participant's ability to engage in remote intervention. It's also important to have more robust measures of dosage, especially as we begin to look at outcomes for trials such as this one. Finally, this data may also help us to better understand why some families take to telehealth while others do not as we continue to enhance our delivery. And with that, I would like to thank all of the families in our study, as well as all of the staff who helped make it possible in the Geste Lab, in the Kasari Lab, in the CAN Clinic. And I would also like to thank the staff at BCH for their support during this and our wonderful partnership with the TS Alliance who helped get the word out about this study to all of our participants. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So pleased to be presenting alongside this group. My name is Ellen Doernberg, and I am going to be presenting on the efficacy of a remote play-based intervention for children with Prader-Willi syndrome. So just a bit of background on social cognition in Prader-Willi syndrome, or PWS. So we know that deficits in social cognition, or more specifically competency, responsiveness, rigidity, and thought and behavior, these emerge pretty early on in life for children with PWS at the toddler or even preschool years. And we also know that we see these impaired pretend play abilities in children with PWS, and these impairments are fairly similar to children with other developmental disorders like autism spectrum disorder, and these pretend play deficits also emerge fairly early on in development. And we also have discovered that remote intervention can be a feasible and acceptable option for an atypical population of children with PWS, as we've seen in a prior study of ours. And from this, we want to really focus on why play specifically for PWS, why this particular area of intervention. Well, we know that play interventions, and specifically pretend play interventions, have been used successfully in typically developing children at the school age to increase imagination and affect expression in play. And we also know that pretend play has really important predictive value for vital areas of development in life, including adaptive functioning, emotion regulation, and behavior. So it would be quite important, especially for these children that struggle in those areas, to target these skills pretty early on in life when children are still developing. And we also know that play-based interventions have been used in ASD and other atypical populations successfully. And we actually see improved outcomes overall for these children in terms of their play, but also more generalized behavior and decrease in problem behaviors. So we want to answer the question, can play-based intervention be an effective option for children with PWS? Well, we know that in a school-age population, like I covered, that this play-based remote intervention is feasible and acceptable among parents and children, so it's doable, and we can have the play across the screen. But we want to answer, is this effective? Can we actually increase play skills and other more generalized skills of functioning for these children that will impact their social cognition? So I'd like to introduce you all to the Pretend program from our lab, the NRL, which is a play-based remote enrichment to enhance development. And this program is really focused on using play-based as well as other skill training areas over a remote telehealth video conferencing format. And we focus this intervention specifically for school-age children, 6 to 11 years old in this sample. The structure of the program is 12 sessions, 2 times a week for 6 weeks, so it's fairly short in length. And the sessions themselves are quite short, just about 15 to 20 minutes each. The process actually includes video conferencing, remote play sessions with a child on one side of the screen and a play interventionist on the other side, where we have mirrored and matching sets of toys that we use. And an example of the toy kit is included above. And the play interventionist uses specific story stems with the child to get the story moving and the pretend play going. And also different techniques to really facilitate and bring out the play skills in the child, including positive reinforcement, prompting, questions, specific praise, to really bring out those play skills for children across the screen. And we also really focus the content of our play around 3 main skill target areas. The first 4 sessions focused on emotion recognition, using play to focus on those. The second set of sessions, the second 4, focused on emotion regulation skills in play and also for the child specifically. And then the last 4 sessions of the 12 focused on cognitive flexibility, both in and outside of play. And we intersperse these 3 parent coaching sessions across these 3 areas to focus on these 3 content areas and how to use play at home, but also some other skills surrounding these 3 different areas of social cognitive development. Our study participants for this sample, we had 18 children in total who participated in this intervention, average age around 8.5. We had an even split in terms of gender and Prader-Willi syndrome subtype of the 2 main subtypes of PWS. And we saw across both cognitive and adaptive behavior scales fairly typical scores that we see in a Prader-Willi syndrome sample. And all children in this study underwent the pretend play intervention. So all children were seen for an in-person baseline assessment. All children were then put into this telehealth intervention twice a week for 6 weeks, and then all children were seen for in-person outcome assessments. Our main study measures for this program were the affect and play scale developed by Dr. Sandra Russ on this research team. It's a 5-minute standardized play task. We use imagination, organization, affect frequency, and affect variety as our main variables, really focusing on cognitive and affective variables in play. It's an individual play task the child does on their own that we score afterwards. And then the multidimensional stimulus fluency measure, or the MSFM, which is really a measure of divergent thinking. It's also a short task, 10 to 20 minutes to complete. We really focus on measuring creativity and idea generation. And we have 3 subtests looking at instances, patterns, and uses to really get a best sense of divergent and cognitive flexibility skills in these children. So following this pretend play intervention and looking at our pre-post results, we were pleased to report that we saw significant gains in some of our main APS variables. So looking at imagination or use of pretend or idea generation or perspective taking in play, we saw a significant increase from pre to post for these children following the remote intervention. We saw that comfort specifically did not change in these children, indicating that they were as comfortable at the beginning as they were at the end of the assessment. And we saw significant changes in organization skills, or how the child structured their play in terms of plot and cause and effect. And we also saw these, well, that was a trending change for organization. And we also saw these changes in variety of affect use and play, significant changes in terms of how many different emotional expressive categories were they able to use in terms of positive affect and negative affect, using fearful affect or happy affect or surprise affect within their play. And I wanted to highlight a few other results that were not represented in that graph. So first off, like I said, that comfort did not change for these children. So we can fairly confidently eliminate the idea that these were practice effects for these children, or they just got more used to the play interventionist from pre to post intervention. And we used a different evaluator for our assessments versus our intervention, but they overall remained comfortable with the choice, and that didn't change from pre to post. We also saw from this supplemental variable, looking at how many different themes were used in play, the children significantly increased their thematic frequency from pre to post. And comparing to a normative, typically developing sample, we see that children are getting closer to typical levels at their outcome visit, but still fairly below in terms of the organization and significantly below their typical peers in terms of the amount of affect used in their play. And then finally, I wanted to point out these cognitive flexibility changes, which were significant pre to post, showing that these changes were able to generalize to another area of functioning from our measure on the MSFM across all 3 subtests and the total fluency measure. So overall, we know that this pretend intervention was successful and efficacious in increasing cognitive and affective play skills for these children. It's particularly noteworthy given the rigidity we see in PWS. And we also know that it's important to have a control group going forward, and that is current data that we're continuing to collect. But again, we would not predict that children in a 6-week span would make these kinds of changes, sort of supporting the efficacy of this intervention. And we also know that the gains made in the play were not just limited to pretend play skill gains, but we actually saw them generalize out to these changes in cognitive flexibility and fluidity in thought and thinking. So we really see this generalization of effect to play skills to other areas of social cognition. And if anyone would like more details on this study, we recently did have a publication come out on these results for further details. So thinking forward for future directions, we want to think about, are there other areas of cognitive flexibility or behavior that pretend play might be able to impact beyond divergent thinking and fluency skills? Also, we want to focus on how changes like this could be extended to the classroom and the home, and really extend into other areas of life. And we are focusing some of our current projects looking at fidelity from interventionist to interventionist to make this intervention, more easily disseminated to different areas in a child's life. And we're also looking at extending our data collection into lower functioning gains in play as well. I would like to thank you so much on behalf of Case Western Reserve University, our NRL lab, specifically to PWSA, our funding agency, the FPWR for continuing our funding, and of course to the children and their parents for participating in our references. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for being here today and engaging in our virtual presentation of intervention practices administered via telehealth. I'm going to switch us towards a conversation of piloted intervention for infants with Fragile X and their parents, talking a little bit through our development and our ongoing telehealth implementation. So a brief background on Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X is the leading known genetic cause of intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the most common inherent form of intellectual disability, with about 30 to 40% of individuals with Fragile X also being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So that males tend to be more affected than females with other co-occurring conditions such as anxiety, attention deficit, disorders, seizures, and aggressive behavior. Children are usually diagnosed at about 3 years of age, with parents having reported early developmental concerns and delays as early as 9 months of age. So we see delays across these 6 core areas that also impact future development. Additionally, there's been some early documentation of brain-based differences in white matter circuits for infants with Fragile X as young as 6 months, kind of setting the stage and the importance for early identification and intervention. In addition to our growing knowledge of the early development of Fragile X, we also have this public health intersection of expanded carrier testing, offering of screening for infants in utero, and newborn screening practices and pilot programs that are looking at the inclusion and screening for Fragile X syndrome in the newborn period. Currently, there are no approved Fragile X specific treatments that are medical and approved by the FDA, but we do know that early treatment in the behavioral realm can improve long-term outcomes. With this knowledge of innovative new practices with identification and a history of early intervention implementation trials, we've developed the Parent and Infants with Fragile X Syndrome intervention. And what we target to do here is provide developmental and behavioral support to parents of infants with Fragile X across the first year of life through a 2-phase targeted parent-mediated program. So a brief background about how we got to where we are with Pixie. We started off with a systematic review of evidence-based intervention for children with autism. So really wanted to think about the domains that overlapped with early intervention practices that were empirically based in the autism realm, knowing that the frequency of autism in Fragile X is high. And once we completed our review, we really decided to approach it as a 2-phase model, with phase 1 focusing on psychoeducation and support for parents, and phase 2 focusing on that early autism symptomology, and particularly with the iBasis FIT program, enhancing the social interactive environment of the campus. So once we had our tools in our toolkit and we were ready to launch, we piloted across 2019, and we approached this first stage of piloting as an iterative case series model, really synthesizing the information that we get from parents and infants to make appropriate adjustments to intervention protocols, such that interventions for infants diagnosed at such an early time is first of its kind. We also decided to implement both with in-home and telehealth options. So we were recruiting from a study that was state-based and takes anywhere from 30 minutes to get to a family to over 3 hours. So we knew we'd need that balance of telehealth with the in-home implementation. And knowing this, we wanted to be really intentional early on about components of telehealth that we could address that would help for acceptability, easy usability, and feasibility of implementation. And we broke it down into 3 main areas. So ensuring access through provision of materials. We made sure all of our families had toys, tablet, webcam, and wireless extenders as necessary. Taking off the burden of logistics. So we provided direct mailings of everything and return processing, so parents didn't have to navigate with packaging up our materials, sending them back, or thinking about how to get them. Provided HIPAA compliant video conferencing and texting capabilities to ensure fluid communication, even though we weren't seeing these families weekly in person. We were also really intentional with our intervention protocol, ensuring that all of our resources were available electronically, either via PDF or online access, utilizing electronic data capture systems for our follow-ups, so families didn't have to make trips into lab to continue their participation, and really in focusing on a parent coaching model that would allow for parents to feel empowered and knowledgeable about being interventionists without hands-on interventionist interaction. So after our first year of piloting with Pixie, we knew that there were 3 core adaptations that we wanted to make. One was transitioning away from iBasis FIP to Infant Start and really further formulating our plan for phase 2 intervention to something that was a bit more concrete and needs-based, but also could be well facilitated through telehealth as necessary. We also learned through engaging with parent advocacy groups that the need for this type of intervention was wide-reaching. So we expanded our eligibility criteria both with age and location, which boded well for telehealth implementation. And we decided to move exclusively through telehealth. So this was a trend that we saw occurring prior to COVID-19, but serendipitously aligned as health policies fell into place, especially with shelter in place. And we found this to be a fluid and easy transition with no discontinuation of engagement based on those foundational pieces we set forth during our first round of piloting. So here's just a brief overview on what Pixie looks like right now and how it's broken down. So you'll see telehealth bi-weekly to weekly based on the phase, the different focuses and what we engage our parents with. So thus far, we've had 11 participants enroll, 9 mother-infant dyads, 1 family where both parents participated, 1 engagement with a foster mother. We have 2 currently finishing up phase 2 that have solely been done via telehealth. And the remaining are engaged in our long-term follow-up that occurs through 3 years of age as we track the developmental outcomes of these kiddos to see the trajectory of infants identified in infancy and having received Pixie as their intervention. So within our iterative case series model, we have the great opportunity to get active feedback on our implementation. So in addition to positive reviews about their satisfaction with Pixie, parents highlighted these successes within the telehealth range. So they felt that they could easily navigate the materials for telehealth implementation and that it was easy to be an active participant via telehealth, and believed that as a result of their participation, they were better able to interact with their child and understand how their baby with Fragile X learns. They also presented us with some of the challenges that we consider as we move forward. So at times it was difficult to attend with older children, and within the context of Fragile X as well, knowing that this is generational, there is an opportunity for an older sibling to also be affected. So there's additional behavioral challenges that come along with that. Some parents did crave that integration of hands-on activities with an interventionist, primarily around demonstration and with motor activities, and some would have liked just to have some in-person touch points. In addition to kind of learning more from our participants, we've taken a lot of lessons learned from our interventionists. So believe that our successes are a wider reach to families with rare neurogenetic conditions. Parent coaching methodologies really encourage implementation of strategies independently by the parent and not just interventionist led. And we have the opportunity to join parents in their home in a really natural environment of comfort, and we can practice across routines and settings. Challenges include those I think we all experience every day with technological difficulties, and particularly within the context of COVID-19, disruption in childcare services that lead to distractions within the home environment. So for our next steps, we continue to want to expand our enrollment to other rare neurogenetic conditions so we can pilot these protocols and serve more families and gain more understanding through our iterative research model. We want to continue not only telehealth implementation, but evaluate this treatment modality a little bit more critically as we integrate other virtual intervention resources. And our next component is also to target more of the maternal, paternal, parental mental health support component. So not only tracking parental mental health symptomology around coping, adjustment, but also piloting intervention techniques that would speak directly to independent parent needs. So I know I'm about a minute over. I just want to thank everyone on the Pixie team and all of our families who so thoughtfully engage with us and help us learn not only for ourselves, but for the future of the communities that we serve. Look forward to talking more.
Thanks for that introduction, Carly. Let me say from the beginning that I think this was a fantastic set of talks and so timely. Given what we've been through in the past year, where most of us had to learn how to teach or to deliver an intervention through a platform, a remote platform like Zoom, most of us had initiation by fire. We did not know what we were doing. And it is clear that all of you have thought about these issues for a while and have really perfected a lot of different aspects of delivering a behavioral intervention remotely. And I think there's so much that the rest of us can learn from you all. So let me start off by saying that, there were a lot of commonalities in your talks. Most of you were focused on rare disorders like TSC or Prader-Willi or Fragile X. The interventions were designed to be remote intentionally and from the beginning. And I think you can see that and that they're more effective when they're designed in this way. Parents were involved, either mediating the intervention or receiving some coaching. And you really focused on accessibility, acceptability, and feasibility at this point in the game. And that makes sense given the evolution of these kinds of intervention delivery models. So I have 3 comments or questions. The first is our beliefs around telehealth. So I think for a lot of us, we think it's easier. And for some aspects might be. So for families, there's no commute, so it's more convenient. Same for the provider. It's real world. So an advantage is you get to zoom in and see exactly what the family is going through or what the child is experiencing. And so you can target your support more clearly. But I don't think the study setup is really easier. And that seems clear to me, given all of the details that you gave us about what you had to think about and what you had to do in order to deliver these interventions. There's a lot of planning that goes into this. And I think it's probably harder than traditional deliveries. So I think, again, we can learn a lot from what you've already experienced. There's another belief about sort of facilitating recruitment, and that was really clear with Carly's TSC study in that they were not able to recruit very many families when it was in person. But once they opened it up to remote, the recruitment and enrollment in the study really increased. So that's important. It also can expand reach in that for some families who don't live close to a medical center or a research center where there's an effective intervention, they can actually receive that intervention when it's delivered remotely. But I think the families that are still accessing these kinds of interventions are mostly white, middle class, and educated. And so that appears to be the same for all of your samples. And I do think that we want to pay attention to this and to really try to expand reach for effective delivery of behavioral interventions to underserved populations or underrepresented in research populations. So those could be culturally and linguistically diverse, low income, minority. And I think there's some real issues to tackle. Cultural adaptations, thinking through the technology supports and supplies and materials and so on. So another question is, are the interventions effective? And I don't think we know yet. Intervention science is not easy, and we tend to try to control a lot of variables so that we have a really clear estimation of whether the intervention is working. And when we do this, oftentimes there are only small effects between an intervention and a control group or 2 different interventions. Or sometimes there's no differences at all. And so I think that is really important information. I think the jury is out on these kinds of interventions, in part because they're still at the pilot stage, so they're not fully powered to really test the efficacy of these different interventions. And part of this has to do with what are the outcomes. So how do we get an outcome that's meaningful for the family and that can show change in these kind of short-term interventions? So these are big issues that we need to tackle. And I know they're ones that you all have worried about and thought about. And I think over the next few years, we're going to get much better at these kind of outcomes and how we measure them. And my last comment has to do with heterogeneity. So some of you talked about this. You said some families may need more support and some may need less. And you can track this like Allie did with her ability to track time spent on the website. Some may need a different intervention at a different age. And I thought that was really interesting what Casey presented with Fragile X kids. And these were babies. And so they had one intervention for very young babies and then a different one as they got a little bit older. And I'm not sure if those were sequenced or were just different interventions that they were trying. I'm sure there's a backstory there, but there are ways to think about sequencing these interventions by age or by need. And then there may be interventions that are needed for different kinds of targets. And Ellen, you talked about this a little bit with your Prader-Willi group who were school-aged and it looked like mostly higher IQ and maybe verbal kiddos. So they were working on symbolic play, but you might have some kids who were not at that level of play, so that you would want to work on lower levels of play with, and maybe even younger kids. So you might need a different intervention or an adaptation to your intervention. And then of course, there are some families and kids who will take to the intervention and respond very quickly, and some will respond much more slowly or not at all. And so thinking about response and what to do about it becomes a critical issue. And so the future may be these adaptive treatment designs. And this is something I've been involved in. It's something Allie mentioned in her talk. And I think that they probably are appropriate to these kinds of deliveries of intervention. So you can see the definition of an adaptive treatment design there on the side. It also requires a lot of planning and a priori decisions. So you might think, oh, I want to use this intervention. And then if there's a response or no response, I'm going to change it to a different intervention. Could add something, I could increase the dose. I could add in parents or, do something different. So all of those decisions get made beforehand. And then you would test the sequence of those interventions and who benefits from that sequence versus a different sequence. So we're doing something like this with at-risk infants for autism. This is a clinic-based intervention, but it's the idea that both families and children are variable. Some families might be able to jump right in and do a parent-mediated intervention. They want to get started right away. Other parents might need a little bit more self-care and more support before they jump into parent-mediated. And so in this design, you can see in the first phase, we compare whether you jump right in or whether you have more mindfulness or self-care. And then we randomize the family, the dyad, to either get parent-mediated or therapist-mediated treatment. And then after a period of time, we have a maintenance phase. And in that maintenance phase, we can actually test whether or not we need to do in-person visits in the home or whether we can use technology to support the family. And again, families will vary on this. So your moderators, your tailoring variables, as they're called here, are really important and are informative. So this could be the future of these kinds of interventions, but I think the first thing to figure out is, do we have an intervention that works? So you want to make sure you've got something that's shown efficacy sort of generally, and then you can add and subtract it into these kind of sequential models. So in summary, then, I kudos to all of you. You've done a fantastic job of thinking through really interesting delivery approaches and interventions for pretty rare disorders. And I think we're going to learn a lot from you. And I'm really looking forward to the next year's Gatlinburg and maybe the next 2 or 3 years in terms of what you're finding and what you're thinking about doing next. So thank you all.